Hey, Jim.
Hey, Steve.
So what did you think about that AC/DC album?
Back in Black?
No.
Flick of the Switch?
No.
Fly on the Wall?
No.
Razor's Edge? Come on. Black Ice?
No.
You mean Power Up?
No.
Oh, man, they all sound the same. And greetings once again, and welcome to Two Guys Talking About Records, a Vinyl Community podcast. My name's Jim. I'm a record store owner, and I like AC/DC.
And I'm Steve, a record collector. I also like AC/DC, even if they sound the same.
They have been around for a long time, right?
Very long
And
time.
apparently their sound hasn't changed much.
No.
So we're joking about this, but I wanted to start with an actual quote from Angus Young. And I don't know when and where this was from, but the quote goes, "I'm sick to death of people saying we've made 11 albums that sound exactly the same, when in fact we've made 12 albums that sound exactly the same." And I don't know how old that quote is, but I think they're up to like 18 albums now that sound exactly the same. So kudos to AC/DC for finding that groove and sticking with it.
They got their niche out there, and we are not stepping away from it, because look at our pocketbooks.
It works.
And look at yours.
So today on the podcast, Steve and I will be talking about bands, artists, bands who have a tremendous amount of longevity. And to what do they owe that? Is it sticking with the same, or is it growth and experimentation? So we'll delve into that shortly.
Yes, and are they still worth buying their albums?
That's always the question we end up with. Will they be on our shelves?
Exactly.
But first, because this is a Vinyl Community podcast, we talk about our recent pickups, and hopefully you got some goodies in the offerings today.
I do. I had come in today a group called Sea Blight. Got it off, I think it was Bandcamp. Heck, it's a very obscure group. There's only 500 albums out there, and the album's called Lemon Lights, which I found is a form of marijuana. I was unaware of this. And a sea blight is a little creature in the sea that bites you when it gets mad. But it is indie pop. There is some shoegaze type elements in there, but it's on the cheerful side of things.
Okay.
So generally, shoegaze is a little depressing, but this is more cheerful. It's three ladies and a gentleman. I'd heard something on another channel, the Vinyl Douche, and I really liked the sound bite, so I bought it. It was a really good album. I like that.
So if there can be such a thing as bubblegum psych and bubblegum pop, could we say bubblegum shoegaze?
There we might as well. We have, ladies and gentlemen, we have a brand new genre that's just been invented. Feel free to use it. Bubblegum
shoegaze.
Yes. I got in that brand new reissue from Linda Ronstadt, Canciones de mi Padre, where she took the songs that her father used to sing her as a child. I had two originals of that, which I wish I had, because they go for a lot of money now. But I wasn't going to. This was a lot cheaper way to go, and I'm not a big Linda Ronstadt fan, but this album is a favorite, because her voice, the way she takes these Mexican songs, it's with there's mariachi type band that's backing her up. It's absolutely gorgeous, and her voice soars. It's just almost like a perfect album to me.
That's just a very recent reissue, too.
It's a it just came out. In fact, I found it at my local at my local record store, Radio Wasteland.
We had it.
Yep. Muddy Waters, Father and Son, just came in from Vinyl Me Please. Again, it was an original I had, but now I got the reissue in on that one. And and from you here, I picked up Granddaddy's Someday. An album came out in 2003, and those that know Granddaddy, he has a pretty good catalog out there. But I found Someday to be his perfect album. It is just so catchy. It is more of an indie rock, but it's bouncy, it's airy, it's fun to listen to. And then that new Alanis Morissette's greatest hits.
Oh, the Alanis Morissette one?
Yeah, yeah. Instead of trying to buy her whole catalog, here we go, folks. Back to the greatest hits. I love her hits, so I don't want to buy all these albums or CDs. I'll just get this, and I'm satisfied.
Good.
How about you?
Well, a quiet week, so to speak. I had one upgrade and one new-ish release that I opened up. The upgrade, I'm going to call it like a lateral move upgrade because I didn't upgrade album per album, but really kind of, if you would, artist for artist. I don't have a whole lot of classical music in my collection. Like most people, I'm not an aficionado, even though I did work at a public radio station once. But, I'll try to keep a couple of the big composers and more famous stuff just for when I'm in the mood. But one thing that I have had, and it was a Deutsche Grammophon box set of all of Beethoven's 9 symphonies.
Yeah.
And I've had that for a while, but it was kind of a clunky box set. And I think it was auto-coupled, meaning that some of the records weren't a complete symphony on one. You had to go to another side. Well, we've got another one that came through, and this was a 7 LP box set from, we talked about these last week, Reader's Digest box set from the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And it's the complete symphonies, the 9 symphonies of Ludwig van Beethoven. And the box set it was in great shape. The vinyl's all in great shape. And it was 1 symphony per record. And there was a couple that had 1 on each side. Some of the shorter symphonies, like the second, which I'm tremendously not familiar with, but we'll listen to. But it also had some great liner notes and a book inside that did a lot of history. So for being a Beethoven completist, I've got one box set I can tuck away. Not really, but if I ever want to go to it, I say, well, I want to hear the da-da-da-da and play that, and I can dig to whichever symphony. And plus, I could educate myself a little bit on the lesser knowns.
So you would be a completist only on symphony, because otherwise you go into that back catalog and you're going to need a whole shelf of stuff.
Not release completist, but artist.
So, and what's your favorite symphony? I'll put you on the spot.
The symphonies, now there's the sonatas and symphonies,
yes,
which these are just the symphonies. It's going to be either 5 or 9. Obviously, the big powerful ones, the booming, the booming ones that kick out there. So
I'm kind of a 6 fan.
Are you?
The pastoral. It's light, it's airy, it's happy. Kind of like my albums I bought, light, airy, and happy.
There you go, bubblegum Beethoven.
Yes.
The other pickup was a release from, probably about 2 months ago, and it was a new album from The Alarm.
Oh.
These guys came out in the late 70s, early 80s, big Brit alternative group. We're not going to call them jangle pop because they were of that Brit style of college radio, alternative music. The Stand, great. 68 Guns, just such a cool tune. But this was new stuff that they kind of conceived and recorded during the whole closures of 20 and 21. And the album is called Forwards. And when it came out, I thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. I listened to one song online. It was pretty good. And I got 2 different copies for the store, one on green vinyl and one on white vinyl. And then I just kind of let them sit. And they haven't been picked up yet. So I finally decided, well, I'm going to open the green one up because it looks kind of cool with the cover. And it is a great album. It harkens back to that sound of The Alarm from the 80s. But it sounds a little bit more mature. And the voice, obviously, is a little more aged, I guess. And this is going to flow well into our subject matter today. But it's a good, solid album that doesn't get overtly political, but still has, The Alarm is going to be a very politically charged band. They kind of came on the heels of The Clash and that mechanism coming out of the UK in the early 80s.
Thank you, Margaret Thatcher.
Yep. But it's not overtly, but it does have some current angst flowing through it. So it's a good album. I'll let you listen to it at some point too. But I'm really getting a kick out of it, and I'm glad I opened one up because now I'll just kind of pull that out of the inventory.
Yes.
And put it on the shelf. But that is the pickups. But that does, I think, dovetail very nicely because The Alarm, while not a band that has been around a long time like the Rolling Stones, as we talked about last week, but we're talking from the 80s, and they were very powerful in the 80s, and not so much in the 90s, quiet in the early 2000s, and now they're back with this new one.
Yeah, that's 40 years.
And they have matured. And that got Steve and I thinking, and we'd been talking before too, especially coming off of the news last week that the Rolling Stones were going to be releasing a brand new album coming up in October, Hackney Diamonds, which, by the way, I didn't realize is slang for broken glass. So be it riots or smash and grabs.
Okay.
That is slang for somebody smashed a window out. The Hackney Diamonds are what's on the ground.
Okay.
But, you talk about a band like the Stones. These guys have been around a long time and, for better or worse, intact as a set of members.
Yeah.
And if we start looking at the longevity of artists, we can take this in two directions, basically. A band or a solo artist. And I think in some ways, this is just my opinion, it's actually harder for a band to be solid for a longer period. We're talking 4 to 5 decades, if not more, or maybe-ish. I'll talk about that in a bit, than it is for a solo artist. A solo artist can move and shape and do what they want, and they can experiment with different stylings as they go through their career and work with different bands, different backing artists and guitarists and session musicians, because they are the main push of the artist, where it's tougher for a band to kind of maintain that cohesiveness for a longer period of time.
As I was thinking about this, that was my exact thought. You could think of dozens of individual artists that went for long periods of time just going to jazz, that alone. But when it comes to a band, there's so many other variables because we're talking individuals. Mm-hmm. And like a marriage, it doesn't always work out. And eventually they tire of each other. They want to get apart. We have different ideas. I want to go this. It does make it very difficult. So somebody like the Rolling Stones, which had a little turnover, but not much, it truly is an amazing feat. But the core, Pink Floyd, the two core, they broke apart with Rodgers and Gilmore. But here with, Jagger and Richards, though sometimes you'd wonder how they stayed up, a little crabby, but they did.
On the subject of Floyd, remind me because I want to circle back around to Gilmore and Waters after we have our talk about the longevity of artists, because there's something that's come up that I want to bring up on that notion. But yeah, you're right. And you take an individual artist, whether they started in a band and broke free on their own, like Van Morrison, he was an artist that we talked about growing from here, or somebody like Bowie, who was pretty much just his own entity for the longest time, and he had a very long and storied career as well.
Yes. And as I was thinking about bands that had been around, really it goes right now almost, the Stones, obviously. But then I was trying to think, in the 70s, what bands are still here? And suddenly, I thought the 80s, you have Depeche Mode. Now, they just put out a new album after 40 years. You have Duran Duran. They're still doing it, and they put out an album recently. X, which started in the late 70s, put out an album just a couple years ago. So you have a few of these from the later 70s into the 80s that are still doing it. A lot of it's because of the concert, the oldies circuit, which at our age, it's hard to, that's really difficult. I listened to that band when I was young. Oh, it's in the oldies now.
I'd be remiss if I let this conversation go without mentioning Rush.
Oh, yes.
Now, the Rush, as we all know it, with Neil Peart on drums, who sadly passed away a few years ago, was not the original drummer. But for all intent and purposes, he is, because when Rush formed, there's some talk, was it the late 60s when they kind of started coming together from different groups. But when they hit in 1974 with their self-titled, John Rutsey was the drummer, but he was dropped before the tour to support that because of health reasons. They had asked him to step aside, and Neil Peart came in literally a few weeks before that 1974 tour started, and then the rest is history. So for all intent and purposes, Rush as a cohesive unit, for me at least, has existed for well over that 40-year span. And their sound has grown and changed with the decades. Now, they gave it up a few years ago, and then, of course, we found out Neil had that rare form of brain cancer and passed away, and they're not going to be doing anything more. But they had a great stretch there for over 40 years.
And just for clarification for those listening, we're talking about groups here where the people, almost the whole band sticks together, because you have someone like Journey that you could say has been around since the 70s, but it's not really. It's It's blown. It's one original member, and that's not. It's by name only.
And that is kind of sad and also, I think, misleading. And, I don't want to slam the groups that are still trying to do this and make a living doing it, but it's not the same, as you mentioned. I found an article from the website ultimateclassicrock.com, classic rock and culture, and this is from May of this year, and it's entitled Bands with No Original Members. Now, these are bands who, as of May, are still touring and still creating, but have zero connection with the band that formed them. Yes, being one of them.
Okay.
Now, Death is going to have a great deal to do with a lot of these bands, but other ones, it's mind-boggling why they still continue on to this. Leonard Skinner, obviously, in there. Little River Band, okay, I don't really have any thought or idea on that. Thin Lizzy. The Hollies, apparently, are still going with no original members on it whatsoever, as is Iron Butterfly. You could have fooled me. Quiet Riot and Rat.
Wow.
With no original members. And this one was actually kind of surprising because Blackfoot. Remember Blackfoot?
Yeah.
Real tough-looking guys from the 70s. They now look like a punk band of some sorts with no original members.
Oh, man.
Mohawks. As Mohawks and everything, as Blackfoot. So, yeah, Quiet Riot, I think I mentioned in through here as well. Humble Pie, touring with none. And then there's even some War with no original members, but how would we know?
Yes.
Then you've got something like the Guess Who. And the Guess Who came out with a new album, not too far back. But the only original member in Guess Who is the drummer. And then everybody else has been replaced, and he somehow won the name in a custody battle of sorts.
Okay.
And is touring and creating as the Guess Who, but none of them are part of that anymore.
Yeah.
And to me, I think that is a disservice.
Yeah, it is. But people want to hear it, and if the music sounds very close, basically they're a tribute band.
Yeah.
And you just wonder, do they get all the rights to it as far as past royalties? Who knows how that all works.
There's one other one that I wanted to mention too, and if only because I just did our new release show coming up for the releases on the 22nd. I don't mean to chuckle. Steve, did you know that there is a new Ventures album coming out next week?
That's number 200?
Something along those lines.
Wow.
It's called New Space. And I had to do some digging on this because our info was a little sparse. But
they're alive?
No.
Okay.
No, they're not. I'll explain. It says the Ventures releasing on September 22. The Ventures return to orbit with New Space, their first all-new studio album in over 30 years.
But they're dead.
And this is basically, they seek to echo, i.e. redo, or pay homage to Ventures in Space, their classic 1964 album, one of their biggest and coolest and best ones ever. So I had to do some digging. I was like, well, how can they do this? Now, the Ventures originally formed in 1958.
Yeah.
Okay? And they are still going strong today with zero of the original members, just like we talked about with those other groups. Wikipedia says that the founding members died in 2018, 2019, and 2022, all in the upper 80s, mid to upper 80s at that point. And despite the passing of all of its founding members, the Ventures continue today with Bob Spalding, who is from the fifth Venture. He's the fifth Venture on guitar. Ian Spalding on rhythm guitar, Luke Griffin on bass, and Leon Taylor, the son of Mel Taylor, who was the Venture's second drummer, playing drums. And he's probably in his 60s by now as well. So that's a tribute band at this point. And it's not like...
It is.
And I'm not going to slam the Ventures because in 1958 through 62, they were tremendously innovative. But that sound, that surf space guitar sound... most anybody can play and pick up on that. And would you know it's the Ventures or not?
Yeah, it gets very similar, and talk about albums that it's kind of AC/DC like after a while.
Yes.
That's Ventures, yep. That's sir.
So you want me to put you down for one?
Yeah, probably not.
Okay.
I did think of a 70s band, should have, for longevity. Kiss.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about a rabid fan base out there that will buy about anything that comes out. I mean, wow. But Still around. Well, are they officially broke up now? Did they stop? Who knows? They keep saying everyone has a farewell tour, and then we do 10 more of them.
Yep. With Kiss, too, I've always joked, too, they could continue with session musicians in full makeup, stunt doubles, if you will, and nobody would know. But then the rabid Kiss fans, we would know. And I'm not besmirching Kiss. They're a solid group, and they have their place in the annals of rock history. But
you also don't want your record store burned down.
No, goodness, yeah. I do not. But let's go back to these groups that have grown and changed. I mentioned Rush earlier. They started as that power trio before Neil Peart, playing on their self-titled album, very hard, acidy type rock. Then they moved into this almost prog space rock with 2112 and the like, into these epics. And then they moved into keyboards in the 80s, and by the mid 80s they had kind of adopted that very Flock of Seagulls, not only look but sound. And then into the 90s they started moving back to hard rock. So they kind of followed the trends, if you will, while still attempting. And I'm speaking as a fan, so if I made fun of Kiss, feel free to make fun of me.
Yeah.
Staying true to themselves as Rush, but their sound, I think, matured and changed as the times matured and changed with them. You can't be together for 40 years without having an outside influence.
That is the key. There has to be, I think, for many groups, especially to come up with an album, there's another influence that comes in. Sometimes they try to keep up with trends, and I don't always find that works. When they're younger, it does. You think of Bowie. Mm-hmm. Bowie was one of the best at trying to keep up with trends. It didn't work to me as well as he got older. Now, a lot of groups are listening to what's going on. Some, as we said at the beginning, like AC/DC, this is our sound. We're sticking with our sound. That's what our fans want. Our fans do not want us to sound like, hey, they brought in keys, man. Not happening. But other groups, we try to evolve to grow your fan base because you want to bring in the younger fans, and that gets difficult, so you change things up. Here's a classic example. And now this is going to be an individual artist. Johnny Cash. He started in 1954 when he put out his first album. And he put out 91 albums.
Wow.
His career was going nowhere. In fact, in the 80s, Columbia, who had supported him his whole life, finally dropped him. The music wasn't changing. It was the same. Along comes Rick Rubin. And Rick Rubin brought it. He's young. He's in his early 20s. And he goes, I want to help you, and here's what I can do. Now, of course, Cash is looking at it. I don't trust this guy. And he's talking to his kids about them. And he goes, no, you need to do this with him. So Rick takes him in and changes Johnny's sound into something more contemporary, not taking away Johnny Cash. It wasn't adding in keys or anything like that, but now we're taking more modern day songs, but making them for Johnny Cash. And it really, it's my favorite Johnny Cash albums. The American Recordings, the first one that came out, I think was just incredible. It sounded so good. He tried to do this with Neil Diamond too. To me, it didn't work nearly as well. But because Neil Diamond, he's more symphonic, more all kinds of other stuff, you think. But for Johnny Cash, that was perfect. And so that outside influence made a huge difference.
If they've got the fan base, they'll stick with them. And especially too, now Johnny Cash, as you mentioned, drifted away because they didn't change. But then how do we look at somebody like Willie Nelson, who's got over 100 albums and still maintains, but he's doing a lot of collaborative work these days?
Big part. You're right. Willie Nelson, 100 albums, 74 of them were studio albums. Since the aughts, he really hasn't done many albums at all, or it's a collaboration, to your point. I think he's kind of at that point. I don't need to, or maybe I'm just out of ideas. I mean, there has to be a time in your life when you're young, you're full of ideas. You're out there, everything's going, man, I want to do this, and this. And then you hit that, well, now what? And you're getting older and your life changes. Now I'm no longer struggling. I got all kinds of stuff. What are you going to complain about? My maid didn't make my bed?
I could pay people to come up with my ideas at this point.
Well, yes, and a lot do. There's a lot of people out there, they're paying them to come up with them, but it's not quite the same because it's those early albums that oftentimes we like of a group, their early stuff, it's coming right from inside of them. It's that angst, it's what they're seeing, or it might be, the love that they're feeling, and later on they're trying to rekindle this and they seem to struggle. And and that's how I look at with a lot of these, whether it be an artist or another group, when, I am happy they're putting out new material. I think it's fantastic, but I'm not jumping to buy it. Maybe, but we have limited resources. Do I really need to have it?
And we're at a point in time where I think the past couple of months, I was surprised every week when I look at the new releases coming up at the sheer number of 80s groups. We're hitting that 40-year mark with the 80s that are coming out with new stuff from there. You mentioned Duran Duran. The Pretenders this week just dropped a brand new album. I haven't listened to any of it, but there they are with a new album, and it's Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders doing this as well. So they're trying to keep up or at least rekindle something like you said.
At Depeche Mode, I mentioned them. They put out a brand new album this year, and actually some of their better selling albums came out in the aughts, 2013, 2017. They did very well. They do have a rabid fan base, again, that really believe in them, but their music was still speaking to people and maybe, not sounding the same. Though, as we mentioned, for some groups, sounding the same is extremely important.
It's hard to put a peg on that, isn't it?
It is.
So you get somebody like AC/DC, who we made fun of. If they venture away from that, everybody will be huffing and puffing, but AC/DC will still put the stuff out and it will sell. Now, is it as impactful as something like Back in Black or even their earlier stuff, like Dirty Deeds? I don't think so, but it's still solid music. That the new one they did, that Power Up, that PWR Up, it's a solid album. Will I go to it often? Probably not, but I'm not going to besmirch them for it because they're still creating.
Yeah. Bob Dylan. Think about that guy. I mean, how long he's been out there. I'm trying to think here. He's put out like 40 studio albums and 29 live albums. Yep. As he's gotten older, though, you hear more and more live albums that are coming out from him. Or we're going back and taking older songs, I don't know, did he ever do the Standards album that so many of them like to do? I'm not sure what to do. Let's do the Standards. Hello, Rod Stewart, and many of the others. Neil Diamond did it. But in one of his better selling albums, actually, his number 5 best-selling album was Modern Times that he put out in 2006. It's outsold Blonde on Blonde.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and it did very well, and that was, newer material that was out there. Now he keeps putting out stuff, but most of it is, taking other material, which is nothing. That's what Johnny Cash did, and he had great success. And again, Bob Dylan has a big fan base. It's just they don't sell as well, but his fans still want it.
We talked about the solo artists having, I think, more freedom because they're not butting heads with somebody else. They've got more freedom to experiment and change their style up. Dylan's a great example because even early on in his career, do you remember the flack he took when he pulled out an electric guitar?
Yeah.
Holy cow, when he started playing that, his loyal folk fans went berserk with it. Then, I'm trying to remember exactly when this is, but he went on that Christian album kick for
he went country first.
He went country, yeah. He did do country with the stuff, and then he went Christian. And he's Dylan. I mean, what more you could say? He's Johnny Cash. He's David Bowie.
And he was young. And I think he could do that. If he got a lot older now and started doing that, people would really be scratching their head and they would start bringing up dementia. I kind of worry about that. It would make it tougher. But at his age, you're right. He was Dylan. At that time, he was making enough money. I can just do this if I want to do this because I have it. And many of them can put out, even now he could do whatever he wants because he has the money for it.
And he's Bob Dylan.
Yes.
He's scratching your head. I'm laughing. I chuckled when you said that because let's go back to Van Morrison. He is somebody who started in a group. And then early on, we're talking early on, broke from that group, late 60s from them, and broke into his solo career, which was tremendously successful. He's still active today. He put out some sort of a weird lockdown thing where he was grumping about stuff and the lockdowns. And then earlier this year, he put out a skiffle album, and I wasn't quite sure what that was. I had to look, but it was Moving on Skiffle. And according to Wikipedia, skiffle is a genre of folk music with influences from American folk, blues, country, bluegrass, and jazz, generally performed with a mixture of manufactured and homemade improvised instruments.
Jimmy Page, John Lennon, they all did skiffle.
Yeah. Well, and now, taking this even further, I just today saw that Van Morrison has another new album scheduled for November called Accentuate the Positive. And according to what I'm reading, he's revisiting the early rock genre and covering and reimagining,
yes,
there's that word, reimagining his personal favorites. Things such as the Johnny Burnett Trio's Lonesome Train, Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, Shakin' All Over, Big Joe Turner, Rock and Roll, Flip, Flop, and Fly. So we're kind of coming full circle. Maybe he's not coming up with fresh new ideas. But again, who are you to argue with somebody who's had that success when he says, I want to do an album of early 50s rock standards?
Yeah, he's put out actually 44 studio albums. His last big one that he really had of his newer stuff was Play the Devil in 2006, which sold about 60,000 copies. I like Van Morrison. I wouldn't go up and give him a hug because you'd get punched or something. Yeah. I mean, that would be dangerous, or even to look him in the eye, you know, he might poke it out. But I don't get excited, to go buy his music. No. I like what he's trying to do, different things and coming up with stuff, and that's fantastic, and really it keeps them fresh. Yep. And it excites them. But I haven't bought a Van Morrison album in years. I used to have them on CD, but now I won't, I just won't listen to it.
Well, the early stuff is preferable because that's his more popular, more well-known things.
It is. And that's what, I grew up more with having and listening to. And maybe I'm just a curmudgeon now. Well, that's sure not Moondance, is it?
The idea of a band's, let's go back to the band as a whole, the idea of longevity, and let's take the Rolling Stones again as a good example of this. 2 original members left in Mick and Keith. Now, Ron Wood has been with the Stones for however long, but he's not an OG. Mm-hmm. We'll think of it like that. He started with Stewart and the like. The Stones obviously are the Rolling Stones. You're not going to argue with them. You're not going to say that they compromised in this, that, or the other thing. They may have had some dry spells. But then if we compare them to a short-lived group like the Beatles, who were technically, around less than 7 years, 6, 7 years, as recording and releasing. I mean, they were together, obviously, before and then after as solo and then collaborations. But it's hard to think of bands that can have an impact other than the Beatles if they've not been around as long as the Stones have. I know I'm kind of comparing apples to oranges in this case, but you see where I'm going.
Oh, yeah. Put Led Zeppelin in with that. Yeah. Would they still be as influential? People would flock to hear them. People, their concerts, no doubt, would sell out because we're thinking, I want to hear the old stuff. How creative would their newer music be? I mean, that's tough. We talked about that new Rolling Stones album last year. It's been a long time since they put out a studio album.
Oh, yeah.
It's not easy, to come up with all this. You just think, how much more do you have in your gas tank? And as you're trying to figure things out. And that would be the same with, the Beatles and Zeppelin. Sometimes you think it's best for a group like that. When they ended on top.
Yeah.
Well, okay, maybe Zeppelin had put out In Through the Outdoor with Hot Dog on there. Maybe that wasn't quite on top, but I did like that album.
Well, let's take this as, and I don't mean to be offensive sounding with bands that are shorter lived, but it's almost a blessing in some cases that some of these artists didn't make it, because I could not picture Zeppelin breaking apart for those kind of personal reasons, or worse yet, ending up on like a county fair circuit or a bar circuit somewhere, like some of these other bigger bands. I watched Foghat play in a bar in the Upper Peninsula in the 90s. And while it was cool and everybody was having a great time, I was working in the bar. I didn't go see the concert. I was working, so I was sober. And I got to observe this thinking, this is just kind of sad.
I would totally agree with that, and I'm sure the band members are up there too. Hey,
Pissy
from
about
stadium to northern Michigan
Playing
bar.
in a bar attached to a bowling alley.
Yes, wow. Yeah, but it's a living. What are you going to do?
Well,
I have to make a living, and hopefully your royalty checks are still coming in, that from your other albums.
the funny part of that is they didn't take the stage until probably about midnight. And by that time, everybody in the bar had time to get themselves worked up.
Yeah.
They no sooner took the stage, and this sounds like something out of The Simpsons when people started screaming, "Play Slow Ride!
Yeah.
Play Slow Ride!" So they did.
Uh-huh.
And then come 1:45, "Play Slow Ride!" So they did.
Now that's kind of sad.
They gave the fans what they wanted, no matter how inebriated they
Yes,
were.
wow. Well, we just did 2 hours of slow ride, but they didn't seem to care.
The extended jam version.
Yes. Well, at least you don't have to memorize. You come up with your set list. Slow ride. All right, we got it. We'll do it reggae style now. Another example of that, when I look at, and I just want to, I want to mention Miles Davis. He put out 60 studio albums. He had success up till when he died. So you think 60 studio albums. His last album was Doo-Bop, and it was his 14th best-selling album. One of the ones before that was Tutu, which was his number 4th best-selling album. Sold over 100,000 copies. People were still interested in what he was doing. Now, some of that later Davis I did much care for. He wasn't playing his trumpet much. It was a little harder. He played more keys. But he was updating his sound, but he would have the right musicians. Miles Davis was a genius at finding the right people to play with him, to move his music along. Now, a lot of times a band, maybe sometimes you might get a little, okay, well, we've all kind of tapped out. In jazz, you're always changing who's there so you can bring in new people, new ideas, and thus the music stays fresh. And I think that's a big part that can help longevity because jazz artists, they play forever and put out album after album, but it's always a different cast on it.
Well, that's a good idea to bring into this, too, is the butting of heads can be beneficial in some cases to the creative process or detrimental, as is the case with something like Pink Floyd.
Yes.
Now, I look at Floyd like I look at Rush, and I'm bringing Rush up again because I look at bands that have this longer lifespan as having, eras, if you will. Rush had their earlier era, then their keyboard, and earlier than their prog rock and space rock, then their keyboard, then their harder rock era. And Floyd, I kind of break up into, okay, you've got your Syd Barrett era, Floyd, and I do count the second album as that, even though it was minimal with his involvement on there. And then you get your really kind of classic Pink Floyd and Animals and Wish You Were Here and Dark Side and The Wall. And then it kind of breaks with Roger, even though he was involved still. There was that big break as it goes further into the post-Waters era. And each one of those Floyds, I think, has its ups. It has its strong points. It has its weak points. It has its stuff like, why did they record this? But it's also one of those groups, if you think of the overall span, they have a great body of work, whether it be where they're butting heads or working separately.
I noticed you mentioned Animals first when you went through the catalog. Kind of funny about that one. That is his number one.
It is.
Pink Floyd album. Yes, it definitely was. Their final one that they did together, that one kind of fell apart, but it was a Roger Waters solo album. The Wall started to become a Waters solo album, but Gilmour was in there and was adding guitar parts and everything like that. And by that time, Wright and Mason were no longer really anything dealing with any of the music.
And it's sad that they couldn't overcome it, but again, I cannot picture what Floyd would have become had they just said, let's do this for the money.
Yes, very true. It really, and when you think, so the other three went off on their own, and they did create some very nice albums. They were more commercial, and you could see the totally different. Now, we were no longer about some theme that generally was dark or whatever, because that's Roger's thing, which he kept going. So they were they were more atmospheric.
Yep. Something like Endless River, for crying out loud.
Yes, which was a very good selling album. That was, that sold 2.5 million copies.
Wow.
The Endless River. So people were still excited. They might go, well, that's not the Pink Floyd of old. It wasn't, but 2.5 million of them sold, so there must have been something they liked on it.
Now, I bring up Pink Floyd as we near the end of our conversation today for a good reason. Earlier this year, and I think you and I talked about this long before the podcast, it's the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
And earlier they released this huge box set. And what was not included in the box set, but what was not part of that release was a single album reissue of Dark Side of the Moon.
Okay.
And we'll get to that in a second. But then they released the live concert, which we both raved about, the 50th anniversary of that, the concert from the next year of Dark Side of the Moon, which was just a phenomenal, one of the best live recordings of all time,
Yes.
and done commercially makes it even better. Well, now comes news I caught today that Pink Floyd, the entity, is reissuing the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon proper as a standalone album. And this is the remix that was included in the 2023 of that big box set, but they didn't sell the album separately. So they are releasing this on the 13th. It's going to be competitively priced, about $35 new. Looks like it's going to have the original posters, the original postcards.
Well,
they're going to go back to that original and be faithful to the release. But on October 6th, the week before the reissue of Pink Floyd's 50th anniversary, we get the Dark Side of the Moon redo by Roger Waters.
What a coincidence. Isn't that odd how those just kind of fell that way?
Yes, I will agree. It's a tremendous coincidence that this is coming out. But Roger's take on this is a little bit different. Earlier this year, he did kind of a stripped-down EP of reworked versions of Floyd songs that he had recorded during the pandemic. A couple from The Wall. They were just really kind of very slowed down, and, well, his voice has matured, obviously. Yeah. And it had that kind of that grumpy old man feel to them because, Roger Waters always kind of took The Wall. It was very like chameleon-like as far as his interpretation of what it meant, and it's changed over the years. But that's just Roger. But I have to read this description to you of Roger Waters' Dark Side of the Moon redo, R-E-D-U-X, by the way. To celebrate the 50th anniversary year of Dark Side of the Moon, Roger Waters announces the release of his homage to the original Dark Side of the Moon redo. Waters says, quote, "When we recorded the stripped down songs for the lockdown sessions, the 50th anniversary release of Dark Side of the Moon was looming on the horizon. It occurred to me that the Dark Side of the Moon could well be a suitable candidate for a similar reworking, partly as a tribute to the original work, but also to readdress the political and emotional message of the whole album." I don't really consider Dark Side to be a political album, but Roger, you do you. So he discussed it amongst his current bandmates, and when they stopped giggling and shouting, "You must be effing mad" at one another, we decided to take it on. And it's turned out really great, and he's excited for everyone to hear it. On top of that, Waters also says this is really a great way to put the screws to that effing Gilmore. No, I made that last part up. He did not say that, but you know damn well he meant it.
He meant that, yeah.
So here you've got, I don't know how to feel about this. Yes, okay, we're going to get anniversary reissues. Great, it exposes new fans, but Roger couldn't leave this one well enough alone, could he?
No, you're taking a perfect album, and we're going to make it more perfect. I mean, it just sounds absolute disaster to me. There are those that are, the big Roger Waters fans. You may love this, but still to take an album that's so iconic, that's sold more than anything, and think, well, I think we can make it a little bit better. Right.
Okay, and we're talking about longevity and why Floyd broke up. This description, by the way, was obviously written by Roger Waters' PR firm, because it concludes by saying Waters co-founded Pink Floyd in the mid-1960s. Under Waters' guidance, Pink Floyd made a series of best-selling albums during the 1970s, of which the most successful and iconic were Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. All right. Roger Waters left Pink Floyd in 1985 and is now one of the most successful solo artists in the world. So thank you, PR firm, for helping us with that. I don't know what to think about this. Will I get it? probably. Darn it.
I probably won't. I feel I don't need to be a Floyd completist. I'll just wait for some bootleg or something else.
So how important is it overall, do you think, for bands to remain a cohesive unit? We didn't even get to the likes of Aerosmith, for crying out loud. They've been around as well.
Oh my God, yeah.
As a cohesive unit.
Yes.
In and amongst themselves.
And that's been a roller coaster of a ride with that group.
It has, but they're still doing it.
They're still doing it.
They're canceling some shows.
Yeah.
They're canceling some shows health-wise. But, I mean, I don't think there's a real answer to this. Is like, does a band owe its success to longevity, or is the longevity owed to the band's success?
I think what the excitement comes for the fans. If the group is a good, successful group, many people want to still go see Aerosmith, if they were to come in. Is that this is great. Yes, they're out there. They're in their upper 70s, maybe 80s, or Rolling Stones. They'll sell everything else. That longevity is exciting. I saw them. That might be the last time. That's great. Music-wise, I think it's very difficult for them unless something really else comes in to kind of give them the spur. So looking at the recordings isn't a big deal for me, and I rarely will buy these older recordings. To see them in concert, no doubt, would be exciting.
I guess a great question to end up on would be, do you see any artists today, contemporarily, that you think will have the staying power of Aerosmith, the Stones, what Rush had done for 40 years, or I can't count the Ventures. Let's exclude them because they're not real. But the bands and the artists that have maintained themselves for 4 to 5 decades, in some cases coming up on 6 for Willie. Yeah. Is there anybody that can do this and replicate this 40 years down the line from where we are now?
I think some that will try, like a David Grohl. Mm-hmm. Because he's always coming up with new things, new ideas. He's very involved in different stuff, so he has a lot of ideas. Jack White comes to mind. He's always trying to reinvent and do different things. I could see them having a long career. Like Willie Nelson, well, you know what? These people live on the fans. I mean, when you get that adoration, and that's part of your life, it's pretty hard to put that away, which is why I think so many of them, Willie Nelson's still out there. You go out and you have 50,000 people cheering you, that just picks you up. Why not just keep it going?
Well, that and whatever drugs are keeping Keith Richards alive.
Yes, it's and maybe when he passes, they will have those for longevity drugs, and we'll finally know.
If he gets cremated, there's going to be a hazmat warning for miles.
Yes,
so we'll have to be careful. I'm kidding. I love Keith Richards. Thank you very much on that. All right, well, Steve, thank you again. This is a fun conversation.
This was excellent. It really was a fun time. And you know what? There is no right, there's no wrong answer. It just kind of comes to be, your thoughts on different artists. And some of these you love and you want to see them go forever, and others you go, whatever.
I'll see them at the bar next week.
Yes.
But I am thankful that some of these bands were around for as long as they were. And I'm even thankful for some of them that created some stuff that I wasn't too happy with that I'm revisiting now, saying I now understand that this was part of their process.
Yeah. Yep.
And maturation.
Often you need to revisit years later and you go, I get it.
Well, you have been listening to Two Guys Talking About Records, a Vinyl Community podcast. As always, it's been a pleasure, Steve.
As always, too, Jim.
I am Jim. I'm a record store owner.
And I am Steve, a record collector. And thank you for listening.